When it comes to knowledge, should we only believe those things that we can actually see for ourselves, or when is it okay to just take somebody else's word for it? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. And we've been talking about in this playlist material or informal fallacies, and those are errors in reasoning that are the result of some kind of mistake that it doesn't have to do with the form or structure of the argument. If you're interested in those kinds of errors, then go ahead and check out my playlist on Introduction to Propositional Logic. Today, we're going to be talking about the Argumentum ad Verecundiam, or appeal to illegitimate authority. What kinds of things do we know? What kinds of things should we believe? One tempting or attractive criterion is that you should only say that you know the things that you yourself perceive, right? That you have firsthand evidence for. Possibly even you should only believe the things that you yourself see. And yet, think about the things that we think we know. One example is water is H2O. Consider that proposition. Seems like we know that, right? If I were to ask you on the street, hey, do you know what water is? And you said, yeah, H2O, right? That would be something that people would admit, yeah, he knows that, she knows that. But why do you think you know water is H2O? Have you seen hydrogen and oxygen molecules combining to make water? No. Likely you read it in a science textbook. That's okay. And then think about the person who wrote that in the science textbook. Is it necessarily true that that person must have seen it herself underneath the microscope in order to write that in the textbook? No, not necessarily. I mean, think about all the different things that go into a textbook. Nobody can see every single thing that actually is put into that textbook. So likely the person that wrote that sentence is going to be taking that on the authority of somebody else who did see that, who did see hydrogen and oxygen combining and saw that that was what water is. This would be what's called an appeal to authority. An appeal to authority is when we rely on the testimony of somebody else as a basis for our belief, possibly even as a basis for knowledge. That proposition, water is H2O, has a good claim to be something that we know, even if we haven't seen it. And this is something that, we actually do quite often. It's necessary for us to build any kind of a sophisticated system of knowledge to rely on what other people report about their different fields. It's not possible for anybody to go out there and get a PhD in all subjects. If you want to advance your particular area of knowledge, then since the world isn't divided up into just these little sections of, here's my physics and here's my biology, it's all one big mishmash, you're going to have to go to those different areas and see what they have to say and try to incorporate that together. But you can't be an expert in all those things, so you're going to have to ask the experts in those fields. So in order for us to build a system of knowledge, we're going to have to depend on the testimony of other people who are experts in their fields. And that's okay. If I can trust my own reasoning faculties, and everybody else seems like they have the same or very similar reasoning faculties, so it seems like I can trust their reasoning faculties as well. And, so far as I'm willing to trust my own sense gathering faculties, same thing for everybody else. Of course, the big question is, can I trust that they're reporting truthfully, that they're not biased? And that's going to be one of the sticking points that we'll talk about going forward here. But so long as I could do that, seems like I can trust what they have to say, that I can appeal to their authority on whatever area. So let's talk about a couple of areas of legitimate authority, and then we'll talk about the material fallacy here. One kind of an authority that we have to appeal to, which isn't like an expertise type of an authority, but eyewitness testimony. So for example, when we're looking at history, it's almost exclusively based on eyewitness testimony. Did Caesar cross the Rubicon? I don't know. I have to rely on what people who actually saw what happened, what they report to me. Otherwise, I just have no idea, because the past is inaccessible. So in order to believe anything about the past, we have to rely on what somebody else has to say. Another reason for eyewitness testimony is there may be some equipment that is inaccessible to you. So is it true that the Higgs boson particle exists? I haven't seen one myself, and I don't have a large hadron collider laying around in my house, so I'm going to have to, go with what the scientists that do have that equipment available to them. I have to go with the report that they saw those things, or at least the equipment that they're using, that they saw the equipment and how it was affected by those particles coming off of those explosions. So there's eyewitness testimony. There's also opinions that have been formed by some kind of expertise. And this works for stuff like art. Is the Mona Lisa a good painting? I don't know. I saw it in Le Louvre and I thought it was okay. I don't know. I saw it's like on its own wall, and it's cordoned off like this huge area. People are all taking pictures using their cell phone. And I'm thinking, there are pictures of this online. You don't have to take a picture like this. But is it an amazing piece of art? I'm going to have to take an artist's word for it. I'm going to have to take your word for it if you've spent all this time painting and you see, all these different pictures and you have a well-informed taste that I don't have. I'm going to have to take your word that it's a good painting because it just looked okay to me. So there's eyewitness testimony that has to do with stuff like history or just equipment that you don't have available to you. There is opinions formed by experience. This is something like, well-formed tastes in art, or maybe judgment calls, in maybe sports or something like that. Do you take your ace pitcher out in the fifth inning when he's dealing just because the stats say so? Some managers are going to say, no, based on my expertise here, I'm going to go with my gut, right? And ride the hot hand. A lot of metaphors there. But there's also relying on the research of others because the expertise is just impractical to attain for a layperson. So, for example, this is going to be a very fruitful example, by the way. Whenever I think about appeal to authority, this is one of the things that I think of. There's a famous debate between William Lane Craig and Lawrence Krauss. William Lane Craig is a philosopher. Lawrence Krauss is a physicist, and they had this debate on the existence of God. And notice how both of them are kind of out of their fields in a little bit, right? Krauss is not a philosopher, so he's talking about the existence of God. That's sort of out of his field. Craig is not a physicist, so they're going to start talking about the beginnings of the universe. He doesn't have that kind of expertise. So they're both kind of out of their field. And I mean, they're in their field and out of their field in different ways. So they have to, in some ways, appeal to some authority. So William Lane Craig has this cosmological argument he likes, which goes something like this. All things that begin to exist require a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe requires a cause. The implication being that that thing that caused the universe to begin to exist would be God, and that God did not begin to exist, so he wouldn't require a cause. Now, premise one is pretty uncontroversial. You'd have to do some serious special pleading to get somebody to believe that a thing could just appear out of nowhere without any kind of cause. But premise two is the one that Krauss wants to go after. So in order to establish that, Craig appeals first to some philosophical arguments, Zeno's paradoxes and some other things, Hilbert's Hotel. But second, he appeals to the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem says that if, on average, the world is expanding along a given world line, then that world line can't go back in the past infinitely. So in other words, it has to have some beginning. So notice that means that not only if you pick a specific model of the universe, but if you pick any model that our current science, our best science has, or any model that it could have, then we would have to go back to some kind of beginning, and then the cosmological argument would go through. Now, why does William Lane Craig get to use the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem? He's not a physicist. Well, I mean, he could go and get years and years of training in math and physics and all those kinds of things. And during all that time, there are a lot of philosophy that he could have been doing that he would be missing out on. But then ultimately he could establish it for himself just for this one premise. Sure, he could do that. But why? When an expert in the field has already established that this is the case, why not just rely on their expertise? And that's what he does. Now, I should say that I don't think that necessarily excludes us from the obligation to verify the argumentation of an expert in their field. It is the case that there are some facts that we just don't have access to as lay people, and yet the faculty of reasoning that's used to come to certain conclusion given certain facts, that is available to everybody. So I think when we look at what an expert has to say, yeah, there are cases where experts get it wrong, where they have all the information before them, and even a layperson can say, hey, what about this? Did you think about that? Seems like your argument is fallacious here. However, I think given that caveat, I think we definitely need to be careful about making conclusions on our own. So experts will also have knowledge of facts that don't seem pertinent at the time, but if you're trying to make a certain conclusion, will be counterexamples or will preclude that conclusion. So for example, if you were a philosopher of math and you wanted to say, I believe that our knowledge of math is innate, that all human beings just know math. We're born that way. Like, let's say you're Socrates and you believe that there's some prior existence, our souls knew math before they came into these bodies or something like that. And you rested that theory on the fact that all human societies have developed math. Well, anthropologists have discovered 2 tribes in the Amazon that have not developed math. So, there goes that theory. And not necessarily there goes that theory, but at least it's the case that that theory would have to be amended to include this new information. And it would not be the philosopher of math's fault for not knowing these things, but the philosopher of math would have to go and actually, ask the experts in that field, hey, is there any society that doesn't have math? But what is it exactly that makes someone a legitimate authority on some topic? I think there are 2 things. The first thing being you have to be an expert in your field. And what is it exactly that constitutes being an expert? Well, I don't think that that's an easy answer, but I think there are a few things that we can appeal to as sort of a litmus test maybe, or more so things that give credibility to you being an expert in your field. First is that you're conversant with all the different theories on a specific topic. You don't just know what your theory is, you know what all the theories are on the topic, and you understand how they all interplay. A second would be a vote of confidence from colleagues. If you're part of a community of academics that study this kind of a thing, then and maybe published in a peer-reviewed journal, maybe you have some degree, maybe just people converse with you all the time that study these things, something like that you have some kind of community of fellow travelers along this path of knowledge. Wow, that was a pathetic metaphor. But you know what I'm talking about. A third thing would be maybe a corroboration. You have somebody else that says, yeah, I think your theory is legit. Somebody who's an expert in the field, or in the case of eyewitness testimony, somebody else that saw whatever it is that you're saying happened. Another scientist at the LHC that saw the Higgs bosons coming out, or that sounds like you're actually looking and they're just squeezing out. That's not what I mean. So first, I think you need to be an expert. Second, I think, is trustworthiness. We can only appeal to you as an authority if you're trustworthy. So that means that you're honest, you are not biased, or at least not so biased that, we can't rely on what you have to say about something, sober-minded, thorough. There are a few things that could go into this criterion of trustworthiness, but those are the 2 criteria that I would say: expertise and reliability. Those are the 2 things that we need in order to appeal to you as an authority. Now, of course, if those are the things that make you an authority, that make the appeal to you as an authority legitimate, then if you don't have those things, then that is an illegitimate appeal to authority. And that's what we're talking about today, the Argumentum ad Verecundiam. In Latin, that literally means appeal to authority, but as we've seen, there are some legitimate appeals to authority, or at least arguably so. So this would be when you're appealing to an authority and something goes wrong. It's an illegitimate appeal. And this could happen for, like I said, not having those 2 things. You're appealing to someone who's not an expert, or you are is not reliable. But a third reason we'll see at the very end here is that it could be an illegitimate appeal because of something of the person that's appealing to that authority. But again, we'll talk about it in a sec. So let's first look at that expertise. Why would you believe something that somebody says who is not an expert in that field, who is not an expert in what they're saying? Well, this could actually happen for a number of reasons. The first reason would be that they're an expert in a different field, and it seems like that lends credibility to them in this field. So, for example, if you think that, because they're intelligent enough to be an expert in one field, then that makes them able to speak with authority on other fields. Like if a medical doctor started talking about the environment, a medical doctor may be very intelligent, but that doesn't mean that they're an expert on what we should do with electric cars or something. I don't know. I'm just coming, off the top of the dome here. But more likely, it's going to be a little bit trickier, where you're appealing to an authority in a field that has to do with the conclusion, but is not enough of an authority, or is only a partial authority or something like that. So, for example, when coronavirus first hit in the United States, Kim Prather is a scientist in UC San Diego, and the LA Times ran an article. By the way, I'm not calling her out because you'll see later on this wasn't her fault, but she is an expert on aerosols on sea foam or sea spray, how aerosols can be spread through sea spray and how they can maintain themselves aloft. And because of that, she was, interviewed by LA Times, and she said, yes, indeed, when you are out there in the ocean, and of course I'm a surfer, so this is interesting to me. When you're out there in the ocean, the 6 feet is not enough to keep you away from some of these aerosols, and they can stick around for a long time. The implication being, it's very dangerous for you to go out and surf right now because the coronavirus is just sitting there waiting to descend upon you. You're breathing out, and everybody is inhaling all the stuff that's sitting out there. Now, Kim Prather is not an epidemiologist. So if her claim was that, stay out of the water because we're all going to die, the virus is just sitting there waiting to kill us. Well, we have no idea if the virus can survive in that kind of harsh climate. Likely it couldn't, So if that were the claim that she were making, then that would be very much speaking out of her field of expertise. And yet LA Times publishes this article. Surfer Magazine tells us to stay out of the water because you're all going to die. The only person that caught this is Stab Magazine, which is an online surf magazine. I think the guy must be in Encinitas or something, Carlsbad. And he pointed out, you're not an epidemiologist, don't make those claims. And he was right. And what's interesting, she was not making those claims. Later on, she published a note that said, hey, I wasn't saying that in the first place. And people are giving me all kinds of hate mail because I'm saying, lock your doors, don't go outside. So one way that we can appeal to people who are not experts is that we're appealing to people that are experts, but not experts in that field. Another way that we can make this mistake is by appealing to somebody who is an expert in a very particular field and ask them a very general question that might have to do with the field, but might be a little too general for their expertise. So, for example, if you were to ask me, is there a second person plural in Spanish? And let's say I was an absolute expert in Latin American Spanish and I knew everything about it, I might say, no, there is no such thing as a second person plural, a you guys kind of a conjugation in Spanish. And yet there is in Spain. So if I had a bigger picture, if I were an expert in all Spanish, then I would be able to answer that question. But if you're asking me and I'm just an expert in one specified corner of the topic, then that question is unavailable to me. I don't have the perspective for it. And it's especially a problem if you're not even aware that that kind of thing exists. Probably the most pernicious way that this appeal to expertise that is not legitimate can go down, though, is not appealing to somebody who's an expert in one field versus another, an expert in a particular field versus a general field, but appealing to people that aren't experts in anything. And here I have in mind internet appeals, appeal to authorities on the internet. And I don't mean people, I'm a person on the internet, so I don't mean necessarily just anybody on the internet is not an authority. What I mean is sometimes you will see people, this especially happens on social media, and I've recently talked about it, and it's just got me pretty frustrated. So I guess I'm going to talk about it again. When you see on Instagram, people will share from someone's feed, like they make it to be shared. They share it in their stories, and they have this big audacious claim. The most recent one I saw that really frustrated me was, here's why Latinos are voting the way that you weren't expecting. And I'm like, dude, I'm a Latino. Are you telling me this is why I'm voting? You have no idea, like, why are you the expert on how Latinos are voting? And that's not to say that you can't claim, here's why in general Latinos vote this particular way, but that's for an expert to say. An expert in this area would go out and ask the Latinos in different areas and have questionnaires and stuff like that. and be basically a social scientist and come to these kinds of conclusions. You're just throwing up some crap on the internet. So when people repost that, when they share it on their stories or something like that, you're basically quoting somebody. You're saying this is fact and here's why, because this person said it, this expert. But they're not experts. They're just some random people. By the way, I also mentioned this phenomenon on a recent video on popular appeal. So this is a good example of how some of these fallacies can overlap. It's a popular appeal because when you see it on so many feeds, you think, oh man, a lot of people must believe it. It must be more plausible. But it's also an illegitimate authority because they're all appealing to this one authority that's not an authority, that's not an expert in anything. So pro tip for you, never share anything unless you check the source and it is an expert in the field that is saying the thing that you're trying to share. Another way that non-experts are appealed to in this way, especially it's pretty famous, is celebrities. So this happens in advertisement, of course. There are some ways where celebrities might be somewhat of experts in field. So athletes endorsing shoes, they would know what's a better shoe because they've used different shoes, although likely they're not endorsing it because it's such a great shoe. But there are other things like you have specifically, like just off the top of my head, I can think of actresses and their perfume lines, that they're endorsing these perfume lines. And just so you know, like a perfume that a famous actress is wearing is likely not sold at CVS. You know what I'm saying? Like they don't probably even, they don't use those perfumes, but they're telling you that this is a great product, you should use it. And they're not necessarily authorities on the field, but there's this sort of psychological appeal to us to listen to what they have to say because they're celebrities. And of course, I think, and I don't want to jump all over them here, but I think also this happens in politics. So now I think there's kind of a quandary here where celebrities are humans, and as humans, like we have to share our beliefs. We have to talk. We have to especially talk about the things that are important to us. And for celebrities, they have a platform and they want their lives to be meaningful, right? I mean, you want to use the platform that you were given and the way that you think, will be the most helpful. So if you believe that something is good, then you're going to want to use your platform to share that. And so that's definitely something that should be respected. But on the other hand, for a lot of people, they're easily persuaded by what a celebrity has to say just because of the star quality, when celebrities are not experts in economics or in politics. And so they're given this undue amount of persuasion that's not really their fault, right? But people will listen to them. So as people, they should share their opinions and they should use their platform in the way they think is best. But as celebrities, they are inadvertently, of course, but misleading people into thinking that they should listen to their authority when they're not authorities. What's the solution here? I think really the solution, you can't tell celebrities to stop talking. They're human beings. I think it's our job to think critically and sure, listen to what a celebrity has to say. But then, if you're going to have an opinion on it, you need to listen to what experts in the field have to say and go and research those things and think about them. Be aware that you will have the propensity to want to agree with your favorite celebrity. So there is appealing to experts that aren't experts. One interesting area where we might appeal to an expertise that you think would be an expertise but is not is personal experience. And here's what I mean. If I'm talking about personal experience as in like, yes, I really did feel that pain in my hand. Yes. Or yes, I really did feel hurt about something. Sure. But here's an example of how personal experience is not a source of authority that we should appeal to. Recently, I saw on Twitter, which I don't enjoy Twitter that much because there's just so much vehemence, but I see this one reporter saying, I just got out of San Francisco. The place has gone to crap. There's crazy homeless population. Not crazy people. Well, there are some crazy people, but more like there's a lot of homelessness and it looks a lot worse than it used to look. So I'm out of here and I'm bummed because it used to be, Jewel of the Pacific. And then there was some people commenting on that saying, yeah, well, I live here and it's not that bad. I can tell you that. This is bogus reporting. Now, I look at both of those comments and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So this person said she saw this stuff. This other person says they live there and they don't see that stuff. I wonder what the truth is. So I went and I looked at the statistics, and yes, indeed, there is a massive increase in homelessness. And that reporter was just saying exactly what the statistics say, that it's everywhere. So how can we not trust the authority or the testimony of somebody who has that personal experience? Well, there are a bunch of different ways that you can be unreliable as a personal experience testimony. You might, I don't know, just get acclimatized to the way the city is. You might not drive by those areas, or you might be driving fast enough that you don't really pay attention or something like that. There are different ways that even though a person would have that experience, they could be wrong about it. Another example is, I know that human trafficking happens in Orange County, where I live in California, and I've never seen it before. And yet I know so because, there are statistics on it. No, I've never seen it except for one time. It was really bizarre. My wife and I are asleep, so are the kids, and we get a knock on the door. I go and I open the little shutter thing, and I'm like, hello? And there's this girl out there that said I texted her my address, and she's there for, she's being human trafficked to me, and I'm like, well, I don't know. She shows me the address on the text, and it is indeed my address, but it wasn't my phone number. Somebody else must have texted her to the wrong address. And I'm looking around my neighborhood like, who the heck is doing, but I wasn't sure what to say. I'm still not sure what I should have done or said. But I was just like, no, that's not me. I'm sorry. And so I know that it exists from that one experience. But from that one experience, I might think, yeah, that's totally rare. But the statistics say otherwise. So just because I live in this area, just because I have a specific experience, doesn't make me an authority, doesn't make me somebody that you should appeal to as knowing what's going on. So we can make an illegitimate appeal to authority because we're appealing to someone who's not an expert. We can also make an illegitimate appeal because the person is not reliable, even if they are an expert. And the first way we can do this, or the first reason this can happen, I want to be very careful about, because it's about, if somebody is too biased, and even if they're an expert being too biased. I want to be careful because I mentioned in the ad hominem video that just because you believe the opposite of something doesn't mean you're unreliable in reporting about that thing or arguing about that thing. You can still be very reliable. In fact, academics all the time teach about stuff that they don't believe, and they present it in a reliable manner. But there are some times when experts or academics will be so biased that they can't perceive what the truth of the matter is because they just, hate something so much or something like that. And it's not that you can tell this because they're always so angry about it, because academics get angry at each other all the time, say mean, nasty things, and yet maintain a level of intellectual integrity. But it still happens. I think since we are not experts in those fields that we're appealing to them for their expertise in, the only way we'll be able to figure this out is if other experts come along and say, hey, yeah, this person is not, this person is just too biased. We all can see each other's perspectives, even if we disagree, but this person just can't see past their own nose. Also, if they show themselves to be biased in something that we do understand, and then when they're talking about stuff we don't understand, we look and we're like, I don't know if I could trust this. Like this person might just be telling me like biased things like they were telling me earlier. We see bias in all kinds of things too, by the way. In the eyewitness testimony, a lot of times you just see what you want to see. But even we're talking about history, we have historical records of the Mayan kings, and some of them read like, this guy was perfect. He beat everybody, never lost a battle, and everybody he beat was grateful that he enslaved them. That's clearly not a very reliable testimony. Another way you can be unreliable is if you're a liar. And I know that sounds kind of weird. So experts in their area lying, but yeah, it happens all the time. For example, bone researcher Yoshihiro Sato famously fabricated all kinds of results and published all kinds of stuff. And it was published in like very high medical journals like JAMA. And people based their further research off of his results, his faked results, and couldn't figure out why they couldn't make it work, all because this guy was lying. So I mean, can you trust anything else this person publishes? No, obviously not. They've shown themselves to be untrustworthy, so we can't really call them as an authority. Now, again, as a layperson, you're not going to be able to catch that. It's going to have to be someone in their field of expertise that catches somebody who's lying about these kinds of things. So you can have an illegitimate appeal to authority because, number one, that person's not an expert. Number two, that person is unreliable. But a third way that we can have this illegitimate appeal to authority is when the person appealing is making some kind of an error. So, for example, you may misunderstand the expert when you're reporting their results. And this happened in the William Lane Craig, Lawrence Krauss debate. Krauss accused Craig of not getting the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and produced an email from Vilenkin himself, which says the following: a possible loophole is that there might be an epoch of contraction prior to the expansion. Models of this sort have been discussed by Aguirre and Grattan and by Carroll and Chen. I don't know if that's supposed to be Jaime, but Jaume Garriga and I are now exploring a picture of the multiverse where the BGV theorem may not apply. Krauss says, see, Craig, you give this theorem, but you're not understanding that there are that only applies to models of the universe that don't have a contraction before their expansion. So, sorry, you just didn't get it. So we could misunderstand what the expert has to say, and then when we present it, it's an illegitimate appeal to authority. We could also misquote the expert. And again, interestingly enough, in this debate, Krauss quotes that guy, and notice like the ellipses in there. Well, William Lane Craig emails Vilenkin directly and says, hey, can you give me the rest of that email? This is crazy. I can't believe this kind of stuff happens, but it does. And he filled out the ellipses for him. And first of all, in regards to the model discussed by Aguirre and Grattan and Carroll and Chen, this is what he had to say afterwards. This is what was in the ellipses. They had to assume, though, that the minimum of entropy was reached at the bounce and offered no mechanism to enforce this condition. It seems to me that it is essentially equivalent to a beginning. In other words, yeah, these guys, even though they have this contraction model before the expansion, they too have a beginning. So that's exactly what Craig was claiming, right? And so what's crazy is that Lawrence Krauss leaves that out, misquotes Vilenkin on, in an academic, I believe it was a blog, I don't remember exactly how he did it, but it was after the debate sometime. And then on that theorem that he's working on, that model that he's working on, he said, I suspect that the theorem can be extended to this case too, maybe with some additional assumptions. So in other words, when he left that part off, it sounds like he's saying this new model I'm working on is going to obviate the whole thing. We're not going to have to worry about it anymore. But no, when you read the second sentence, it says this also is going to have the same problem. So it's crazy. It's proving exactly what Craig was saying, even though Craig's not the physicist Krauss is. It's crazy. I can't believe this kind of, like I said, I can't believe this kind of stuff happens, but it does. Misunderstanding of what the expert says, yeah, that makes sense. But misquotation of what the expert says, that's kind of funky. Not only can you misquote somebody by having this ellipses of death, but you can also misquote somebody by quoting them out of context. So, for example, in that LA Times article on Kim Prather, somewhere in there it says that Prather said, you couldn't pay me enough to go into the ocean right now. And since they were just talking about, in the article was just talking about how the coronavirus might be able to survive floating aloft or something like that, it sounded like Prather was saying it's a death trap because of coronavirus. And what she was really saying is that quote was about the fact that it had just rained, and in Tijuana, Mexico, they don't control at all their sewage, and all their sewage gets flushed out in the rains and comes into San Diego, and it had just rained. And so she was saying, yeah, it's like filth there. I have a friend that almost died who got an infection in his sinuses and nearly died because he surfed afterwards after a rain in Imperial Beach. So she's absolutely right. It is wildly dangerous to surf there after a rain because of Tijuana. But that was out of context. That's not, what it sounded like on the LA Times article. So how do we identify this kind of stuff in this age of information, we have more access to the experts than we ever have before. So you can email people directly, get into contact with them sometimes. Sometimes they'll respond to you, sometimes they won't. So you just got to do the best you can, and hopefully somebody catches it, the misquotations. I have two more. I know this is taking a long time. I have two more of these. One is reporting bias. So when the person quoting the authority is biased as well, they can be overly biased and present what the expert is saying in a way that's misleading. So of course, I don't mean specifically the media here, like mass media, but I kind of do too. Here's an example. In 1901, okay, the USS Maine went down to Cuba in order to help broker a peace between Spain and Cuba. We wanted Cuba to be free from Spain. So we sent a ship down there to sort of convince the Spaniards, hey, you should leave the Cubans alone, let them, handle their own business so that we can engage in business with them. And the Maine exploded. And to this day, we're not totally sure what happened. It could have been a boiler explosion. It could have been a mine that went off. It could have been Spanish demolition. But the next day, the papers read the Spaniards blew up the USS Maine, and it was on after that. And so we fought a war against Spain, helped to liberate Cuba, all because of what these papers are running, when nobody was even sure at the time what had actually happened. So the people reporting the facts can be biased enough to skew things one particular way versus another. And this happens today as well on all sides of all fences. Media bias is a legitimate problem. It is a legitimate thing to be concerned about. And it's not even just them getting the facts wrong. It's also about what they choose to report versus not report. So in the middle of Trump Biden, and I'm going to be on both sides here, okay? Because I saw it on both sides. And the very early part of the year, Tara Reade comes out with these accusations of assault against Biden. Ukraine is still a live possibility as something that Trump had his hands in that shouldn't have. And when I looked, because I like to read as much as I can, MSNBC, CNN did not report Tara Reade at all. They didn't say anything about this person. All the people that were all up in arms about always believe women didn't say a word about Tara Reade, but instead were focusing on Ukraine. Fox News, who was very supportive of Trump, said nothing about Ukraine and was talking nothing but stuff about Tara Reade, and inconsequential things too, like things that barely lent any kind of credibility to her accusations. So it was crazy. You have these different news sources, and they're just not even talking about the same things. Well, how's that possible? If you're reading only one news source, you're looking at nothing but accusations against one guy versus the other guy. And it sucks. It sucks that we have to worry about that stuff. And it's not even just the stuff that they report on. It's also even the language they use, the details that they pick. Was a guy smirking or grinning when he said it? There's a great website I recently saw, the Narratives Project. I'll put a link in the description that shows how the narratives come out and how different language skews the way the scenario reads. It's crazy, but it happens all the time. So my tips for avoiding this, and this is a huge problem, is check multiple sources, pay very special attention to the wording, pay attention to what details they're giving you to set up the scenario of what it is that happened. Pay attention to what you would expect this news outlet to want you to believe. And that sounds crazy talk, like I have a conspiracy theory, but it's not. Look at the different news outlets and you'll see that they all have a typical slant that they will go with. And so you have to sort of try to be objective and say, okay, well, they said this, but I know it's this outlet. What do these guys say? Okay, they said this, but I got to know it's these guys. So yeah, I think it behooves us to really pay attention to those things when we're trying to figure out what decisions we should make as a country. And a final area where we could get it wrong as people reporting what an authority said is when we're appealing to unnamed experts. So now There are times when an expert needs to remain unnamed, especially whistleblowers, somebody who saw something, when we're trying to protect their identity for some possible repercussions for them giving us their expertise. The problem with it is that, well, of course, if there's no good reason for us to not name an expert. But secondly, if it's the case that we're not going to name the expert, then the whole responsibility for reliability rests on the person reporting it. So that means not only do I have to, let's say you're going to, tell me what an unnamed expert said, not only do I have to trust that you are not lying, that you are not misquoting, that you are not miscommunicating, and all those kinds of things, I also have to rely that you reliably checked your source, that source was not biased, that source was reliable, that source was actually an expert in her field. You have to do all of those things, and I have to rest all of that weight of authority on your shoulders as the reporter. And that's a heavy burden to bear, man. So when we have unnamed experts, like I said, we have to protect whistleblowers. We have to protect certain people. Like an expert in their field might be afraid that they'll lose their job if they give their opinion on certain kinds of emissions that are happening. I don't know, something like that. So we have to protect those people. And yet that relegates a large responsibility to the person not revealing the sources. And I even think there's the added disincentive for you as the reporter. If we can't check your sources, you may have not wanted to lie because you were afraid somebody's going to call you on it. But if you could just be like, yeah, unnamed source, then, we can't hold your feet to the fire, so to speak. So it is, like I said, it's important, but we want to avoid it if we can. So that was a lot, man. These informative fallacies are taking a long time. That's all I got for today. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Adios.